This story is not just an oral tradition passed down in my family. My great-grandfather's older brother, Wallace Adams, who was 15 years old in 1856, wrote a reminiscence about events on the western Iowa frontier that year, foreshadowing the final violent clash in March of 1857 between pioneer settlers and Native Americans. Decades ago, after I married and moved to Boone County, Iowa, I occasionally would read references to the central role that Boone County had played in the events leading up to Spirit Lake. In fact, I read about a grave marker and plaque, but until researching this presentation, I didn't know exactly where it was. Its significance to the events leading up to the Spirit Lake massacre seemed confusing. Here's why. In 1925, my great-great-granduncle Wallace Adams wrote a 5-page typewritten single-spaced reminiscence. Several carbon copies were distributed to family members and passed down. He also was a named source in many yellowed newspaper clippings saved by my grandmother. Here is, in part, his account. A quick look at the history books confirms that the winter of 1856-57 was an Iowa winter of epic proportions. In fact, in his reminiscence, Wallace Adams did not want to be accused of exaggerating the severe weather, so he cited the authority of the Reverend Landon Taylor, a presiding elder of the Methodist Church in Northwest Iowa. A 3-day blizzard beginning on December 1st and followed by weeks of intermittent snow and relentless wind accumulated to a depth of 4 feet. Combined with freezing temperatures, it produced a crust, quote, hard enough to bear a man, end of quote. No one could leave for supplies for weeks. Elijah Adams, his sons, and hired workers had harvested 150 tons of prairie meadow hay to sustain his 100 head of cattle through winter. However, a rapidly moving fire set by a settler 1 mile to the south had destroyed 2/3 of the hay harvest. By May 1st, Wallace Adams wrote the heavy snows and frigid weather, combined with a lack of forage, resulted in a loss of 50 head of their cattle. Thomas Teakle, a historian and educator, and author of the first scholarly book, The Spirit Lake Massacre, in 1918, reinforced this dire situation. He describes the winter of 1856-57 in this way, quote, although the white settlers suffered considerably from self-imposed denial of food and from unsuitable houses in which to shelter themselves, their privations could not compare with those of the Indians, end of quote. Unable to dig a well that fall, the 2 older Adams sons, Wallace and Harry, watered their horses in a hole in the icy Little Sioux River near their home. In mid-December of 1856, it was there that they saw a group of about 35 Indians arrive and set up 9 teepees in the nearby timber. Only about 15 were men, and the rest were women and children. According to descendants of the early Smithland settler Curtis Lamb, these Indians had camped farther north on the river for 3 years prior to 1856, and Lamb and his family had a good relationship with them. However, when the Lamb family moved 35 miles northwest to Sioux City, the Indians were not welcomed by the new family living there, so they relocated south near the Adams farm. The next day, after the Indians set up teepees, 7 or 8 of the men came to the Adams home. They brought their, quote, big pipe of peace, and we all took a whiff, end of quote, wrote Wallace Adams. The leader of the band was known as Inkpaduta. Inkpaduta often is referred to as, quote, a renegade, since he had been expelled from his larger Wapakut Dakota tribe. Members of his group camping near Smithland included 4 sons, including twin sons and their wives, his daughter, and son-in-law. Other unrelated members of the group of 35 also have been referred to by historical accounts as outlaws who no longer were welcome in their tribes. During the approximately 2.5 months that the Indians camped there, my great-great-uncle wrote, quote, "Some of them were in our home nearly every day, warming and smoking, and they seemed a jolly bunch, except old Inkpaduta, who was a big, coarse, surly chap about 60 years old. He was never in our house. The women visited us and we traded pork and corn for venison, moccasins, and other things. The snow was very deep and they lived eating our cattle, which were dying daily close to their camp." End of quote. However, other Smithland settlers accused the Indians of killing their cattle and a farmer's dog and stealing unhusked corn that the women dug from beneath the deep snow. 2 settlers saw the women carrying this corn and harassed them with switches. This angered the Indians, and they may have retaliated by killing cattle. Another newspaper account relates that when the starving Indians pursued an elk herd, a settler's dog joined the chase, attacking an Indian. The dog was killed, and the dog's owner retaliated with a severe beating. If we take ourselves back to this day and age, we have to imagine a world in which communication was sporadic and typically lagging by days or weeks. No mail service, and certainly no email, Twitter, or Instagram. Frontier families were truly isolated. In a newspaper interview, Wallace Adams recalled the evening when 3 Indians came to the Adams home, wanting to trade buffalo robes or a small pony for a light double-barreled shotgun. What his father, Elijah Adams, didn't know was that earlier that day, a group of about 17 Smithland settlers, led by Seth Smith, a former captain dressed in an Ohio militia uniform, had arrived at the Indian camp. They told the Indians to leave. 4 of the Indians were absent on a hunting trip, but the settlers seized the remaining guns, saying the Indians could reclaim them as they were leaving the next morning. Inkpaduta protested that heading north, as the vigilantes demanded, would be difficult in such severe winter. He indicated that they would head south. A second incident was reported to take place the morning before the Indians left, and it offered a disturbing warning that in hindsight forecast the coming conflict. The David Hawthorne cabin was just over the hill from the Adams homestead. Hawthorne worked for Adams, and he often was away from home, trapping for animal pelts and herding cattle in the rushes of Monona County to keep them from starving. His wife and 4 children, including an infant, were often alone and dependent on their neighbors, Elijah Adams and his family, to help cut firewood and other chores. A descendant, Mary Hawthorne Boslaw, who was 7 years old in 1857, wrote a detailed account years later of that morning. She said that 2 by 2, 10 Indians, all men, including Inkpaduta, came to her family's cabin. Their faces were painted and they wore headdresses, unlike anything that the Hawthornes had seen before. The Indians asked for food, sitting by their stove for hours and sharpening their knives, tomahawks, and whetstones. More than once, they made a menacing motion with their knives across their throats, motioning to Mary's mother, siblings, and infants sleeping nearby in a crib. As the firewood was running too low to cook enough parched corn to feed them all, Mrs. Hawthorne spoke loudly to her 7-year-old daughter, Mary, telling her to fetch some wood from the Adams neighbors. As she bent over to help her with her cloak, she whispered, "Go get Elijah Adams. The Indians are about to kill us." Mary was too frightened to pass by them on her way to the door, and she climbed through a window. Elijah was working at his barn and he threw down his pitchfork before running to the Hawthorne cabin with the girl. He grabbed a snowshoe at the door. Using the Indian words for get out, he dispersed the Indians. The Hawthorne family attributed this peaceful outcome to the good relationship between Adams and the Indians. However, Inkpaduta also was very wary of soldiers, and the uniform presence at Smithland also could have been a factor. The Indians were gone by the next morning without reclaiming their guns. They left a signal in their campfire telling the 4 Indian hunters to join them. The Smithland settlers had no way of knowing that the Indians had headed north. And of course, the settlers near Spirit Lake had no word of what had happened in Smithland either. Wallace Adams was quoted as saying that his family knew nothing of the vigilante action until 2 days afterwards. He wrote in his reminiscence, quote, "The people made a fearful mistake when they drove them away, for this was the direct cause of the Spirit Lake massacre," end of quote. In the mid-1960s, my family and I became acquainted with Miriam Baker, a descendant of the David Hawthorne family and a columnist for the Sioux City Journal. We established the close connection of our families as Smithland, Iowa pioneers and shared information passed down from our respective families. Miriam Baker relied on the reminiscence of Wallace Adams and other research to write about Smithland's role in the annals of Iowa in the fall of 1967. Spirit Lake also was the title of a fictionalized 957-page account in 1961 by Iowa native and Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist McKinley Cantor. Maybe some of you have read it. I searched my bookshelves and found the hardback copy that was given to my grandmother. Interestingly enough, as a sidelight, I found 2 yellowed letters to the editor of the Des Moines Register in the book. One was written by a woman whose grandmother, a resident of Peterson, Iowa, was mentioned in this book, and she was unhappy that her great-grandfather was portrayed as, quote, a coward. She also had another complaint. Quote, "I think it must be one of the filthiest things on the market and certainly not fit for school or public library where children of all ages have access to it," end of quote. My grandmother had pasted another letter to the editor in the back of the book. The woman wrote, "Author McKinley Cantor should not have been so surprised to learn that some people do not find his book suitable for a school library. It is true, as he states, that he merely wrote about many of the same matters that are discussed in the Bible. I feel that it was his choice of words rather than his subject matter that's under fire. For instance, the Bible refers to the amorous verb as fornicate, while Mr. Cantor brashly takes the 4-letter word shortcut," end of quote. Well, I have no idea what my own grandmother thought of the book, but certainly our public discourse is even less refined today. And in his book, Cantor, however, does mention the brutal winter spent near Smithland and alludes to the conflict with settlers there immediately prior to Inkpaduta's decision to head north. However, knowing what I know about the Woodbury County connection to the Spirit Lake Massacre, I determined to learn more about the role of Boone County, the grave of a 12-year-old boy named Milton Lott, as well as his father, Henry, who was described as, quote, a key player in Iowa's bloodiest conflict between settlers and Indians, end of quote. I found in historical accounts that Henry Lott was known as a horse thief who took advantage of the Indians by giving them bad whiskey. On December 18, 1846, a group of Indians led by Sidomenatoda, also known as Two Fingers, recovered some of their stolen horses at the cabin of Henry Lott near the Boone and Des Moines rivers in Webster County. Lott either ran off or else observed their visit without being detected. The Indians ordered young Milton to round up the horses. Instead, he decided to go for help or possibly find his father, but he was ill-clad for the winter weather, and he succumbed to the freezing cold and snow, dying 20 miles south along the Des Moines River in Boone County. When Lot returned with a rescue expedition, his cabin was ransacked, the horses taken, his wife was in shock, and Milton was missing. His wife died a few weeks later, and he vowed revenge. My husband, who is a Boone County native, took me to the grave marker about 15 miles from our home, above the banks of the Des Moines River. Erected in 1905 by the Madrid Historical Society, it states that this was the first death of a white settler in Boone County. It also reads, in January of 1854, Henry Lott was living north of Fort Dodge in Humboldt County when he and his stepson attacked the camp of Two Fingers, a Sioux chief who was the brother of Inkpaduta, killing him and 6 members of his family. Lott was indicted for the murder, but he disappeared. Some accounts state that Milton's death was the first in what would become known as the Spirit Lake Massacre, end of quote. Historian Tickle, who I mentioned earlier, addressed this assertion in his book. He states, quote, as an explanation of what occurred in Iowa in the spring of 1857, there has been advanced the theory that Inkpaduta was merely seeking revenge for the murder of his brother. This explanation has been advanced so frequently that it has long been accepted by most people as an undoubted fact. In all probability, however, such was not the motive of the Indians. Tickle argues that Inkpaduta and Sidome Nadota weren't brothers, and that the murder by Lot in all probability did not cause Inkpaduta much concern. He stated that Inkpaduta was a lower Sioux, a Wapakut, while Sidome Donato was an upper Sioux, a Sisseton. Quote, it is true, he says, that in some phases of Indian relationship, they might have been spoken of as brothers, but the conditions making such a reference even remotely possible weren't present in the case of the 2 Indian leaders. Hence, the theory of blood revenge cannot be accepted. Furthermore, the term brother within the Sioux was not limited to blood relationship. The tribe consists of a group of men calling one another brother, who are husbands to a group of women calling one another sister. To call one another brother was a common practice and carried with it no idea of relationship as ordinarily interpreted. Indeed, he asserts that Inkpaduta and Two Fingers were enemies and rivals. It is true that Inkpaduta knew that Lot had murdered Two Fingers and had tried to seek justice for it. He appealed to the military to punish Henry Lott. The prosecuting attorney, though, somehow acquired the head of Two Fingers and mounted it on a pole at his house in Homer, near Fort Dodge, in a gesture of contempt. The event undoubtedly shaped Inkpaduta's worldview. Years later, Lot was killed during a quarrel in California, or possibly lynched, according to some accounts. Inkpaduta, according to records, died in 1881 in Brandon, Manitoba. He was described as being in his 60s in 1857, so his age would have been quite advanced by then. In any case, he died of natural causes. The Spirit Lake conflict took place on March 8, 1857, in the vicinity of Spirit Lake in Okoboji. The date of the conflicts with Smithland settlers, as well as the location of Smithland in northwest Iowa, were in greater proximity to Spirit Lake than the murder of Two Fingers by Henry Lott, 100 miles from there in Webster and Boone County 3 years earlier in 1854. Yet old myths die hard. Earlier this year, I picked up a recent history magazine and read again that Inkpaduta's older brother had been murdered by Henry Lott, and that this was the cause of the massacre, with no mention of what had happened at Smithland. Most likely, what happened at Spirit Lake was the culmination of a long series of egregious incidents provoked by the rapidly encroaching pioneer settlement of northern and western Iowa. As I was finalizing my preparations for today's presentation, I discovered a doctoral thesis written by an Iowa State University student, Kevin Timothy Mason, entitled, quote, Forces of Nature, an Environmental History of Inkpaduta's 1857 Attack on Spirit Lake, end of quote. It features references to Miriam Baker's 1967 article in the Annals of Iowa, as well as citations of letters from J. Wallace Adams in the archives of Frank Harriot at State Historical Society of Iowa. Mason writes, the world in which Inkpaduta grew up in northern Iowa borderlands rapidly changed during the 19th century. As Americans entered Dakota-occupied lands, alterations to the environment undercut the ability of the Wapakut to continue vital sustenance patterns. Decimation of animal species, destruction of plant resources, and the introduction of disease resulted as eager Americans plowed under the tall grass prairies. Inkpaduta sought to maintain sovereignty and autonomy for the Wapakut bands living in Iowa. He continues, as historians have toiled to better meet Indigenous people on their own terms, Spirit Lake endures as an event characterized by images of unprovoked, bloodthirsty savages attacking unsuspecting and peaceful agrarian settlers. In reality, the Wapakut under Inkpaduta acted within their traditional cultural constructs to persist in the face of pressures pushed forward by the frontier line and overwhelming environmental distress during the winter of 1856-57. Sometime after 1967, for the first time, a marker was placed along the banks of the Little Sioux River east of Smithland, and a Sioux quartzite boulder was placed 1 mile north on Highway 31, marking the campsite of Inkpaduta and his band of 35 who camped there. It reads, Inkpaduta's campsite. During the harsh winter of 1856-57, Inkpaduta and his outcast band of renegade Sioux Indians camped near the Little Sioux River on the Elijah Adams farm. Relations between the Indians and the whites disintegrated, and following a dispute over allegedly stolen corn, the settlers drove the Indians out of the area in February of 1857. The band headed north up the Little Sioux River Valley to Spirit Lake, where less than a month later they committed the infamous Spirit Lake Massacre. And the rest is history. Thank you very much for your attention today. Are there any questions?
And people can either do those through chat, or if you want to raise your hand, I might be able to figure out how to allow you to talk. I did post in the chat that Dr. Kevin Mason, go ahead and keep your main slide up if you want, Cheryl, in the slideshow view. So just go back to
the beginning? Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, go to play from current slide is fine, and just advance or whatever you want to do. That's a nice one to keep up.
Yep.
Anyway, I did want to point out in the chat, we have a program coming up from the State Historical Society of Iowa and the State Historical Museum of Iowa with Dr. Kevin Mason talking about his dissertation. So hopefully everybody can see that. It's on March 4th. It'll be at noon. Also, Abby Gardner Sharp's home site is one of our state historic sites. I know Michael Plummer, our historic sites administrator, was in this for a bit. So if he wants to chat in any comments, but great presentation, Cheryl. Really appreciated hearing your personal family connection to the story. And I will keep an eye then in the Q&A, and go ahead if you want to, attendees, and either in the chat, that's all good. So somebody said, thanks for a great presentation. That would be Kevin Mason.
Well, that's wonderful to know. I'd love to chat with him sometime. Yeah.
Great, Kevin. And we'll give this to Cheryl, but if anybody else wants to chime in, was there a relationship with the Inkpadutas band and then the Dakota who were connected to the Dakota uprising in New Ulm during the Civil War era? Do you have anything to say to that?
I
Or-
don't know. The one thing that I would say is that in the reminiscence that Wallace Adams wrote, he does make a reference to the New Ulm massacre too, and talks about, he did not have obviously personal experience, but he does mention an individual who had traveled to New Ulm for some business or to get supplies, and had been warned there by an Indian who is no longer connected with the tribe, that if his business was finished, he should leave and go away because it was not going to be a good situation. I mean, he didn't say obviously what was going to happen, but he just warned him to no. So I don't really know if there was a connection, but I do recall that that incident's being recounted in the history that I've read. Do you know, Leo?
I'm muted to the best of my knowledge. Really, Inkpaduta and that band of Sioux had been really separated from the Dakota, and that were at New Ulm area. And much though like Inkpaduta's band, the Dakota people and Minnesota Historical just has some really powerful content at the History Center in St. Paul, connected to the really, I'm trying to think of the right word because it was just so egregious how we treated the Dakota Sioux and many of, nearly every Native nation, that the Dakota Sioux had been forced into a treaty negotiation, whereas Inkpaduta had been kind of, and I may be mischaracterizing this, had been, kind of triangled out of negotiations. The Dakota Sioux had tried to negotiate in good spirit with the United States government, and then the United States government kept forcing them into more and more difficult as a nation to negotiate, whereas Inkpaduta was not really representing the nation's people, the New Ulm, and I when you look at things in context, and I know they're the terms that were used historically, the Dakota were really so taken advantage, and so I don't think it's really fair to discuss their reaction as a massacre, and that's probably all I should say, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Thank you, Stacy Ben-Dixon, for moving your question to the Q&A. Stacy wanted to know just a little bit more background on the Spirit Lake conflict and what you want, and also so just can you summarize the Spirit Lake incident or conflict?
Oh, goodness. Well, I would only summarize it because I really didn't study that for this presentation. And the only thing I know about it is what I learned in history class. But eventually, the Inkpaduta and his band moved north along the Little Sioux River, and there were a few homesteads along the way. I mentioned Peterson, Iowa there, other settlements where they did have some confrontations with settlers. And but it was, I believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong, not until they reached the Spirit Lake and Okoboji area that they actually did that actually settlers lost their lives at the hand of the Indians there, and it was unprovoked, obviously, by the settlers in any way at that, to my knowledge, anyhow. But so, as I mentioned earlier, and I saw a couple of different accounts of whether there were 39 people killed there, or they did take a few hostages, which Abby Gardner was one of them, and not all of those did survive, and so that may account for the difference in the number of people who died as a result. But Leo, would you like to add anything to that?
I think you covered it pretty well. I did give Kevin Mason the chance to talk if he wants to. I would just comment as well. State Curator Emeritus Jerome Thompson had just commended people to look at Letters, Legends, and Lies, readings about Inkpaduta and the Spirit Lake Massacre. And Michael Plummer, current Historic Sites Administrator for the State Historical Society, also commended people to look at Lance Foster's Indians of Iowa. Lance is an enrolled member of the Iowa tribe of Kansas. And so those are a couple of other good resources to consider. Yeah, and I think in our chat there was a question similar to Stacy Ben Dixon's about what happened to Inkpaduta, and you covered that pretty well too. So no, Inkpaduta was never captured. There's went on to live his life till he died a natural death. Any other questions or comments? And again, use Q&A if you don't mind. Chat is fine. As I said, Kevin, I gave you the chance, if you wanted to, that you can maybe able to unmute yourself if you want to add any comments.
I don't have a ton to add. I think Cheryl did a great job. I think I don't know. I appreciate her personal connection and the different types of sources she's bringing into the conversation. I hope to visit with her a little bit more. With Inkpaduta, one of the things I think about, and in my research at Iowa State, I think one of the things that just really struck me and why I started pursuing this topic is you can really see how this environment's changing. I think Cheryl did a good job of talking about some of those passages. I'll have, you guys mentioned I have the talk coming up on the 4th, but then in the next issue of Annals of Iowa, I'll also have a kind of summarization for a more general audience coming out that'll talk about the conflict as well. So keep an eye out for that. That might, if this is something that's caught your interest today at History Camp, could be hopefully some ways to explore it a little bit further. And I'm glad people are starting to have some really, I think, interesting and forward-thinking conversations about this important part of Iowa's history. And that's hopefully something that'll build and keep the historiography growing and help us represent kind of the Dakota and Iowa in a little more realistic way as we continue to look at our own shared past.
Thanks so much, Dr. Mason. Appreciate you joining us today too. And really do commend people to take advantage of the resources. Once the Gardner Sharp Cabin is open, it is a great historic site. We're honored and really are trying to be more broad ranging in storytelling up there with what I'll say Mike Plummer is doing, and what Jerome Thompson had done to work with the Dickinson County Conservation Board. So, really understanding the nuances of history is something the Historical Society is committed to. That history is complex. It's not revisionism. It's looking at new evidence. It's telling the story in a broader way. And so I understand, and nobody has made this comment, but sometimes people feel like, telling stories from different perspectives is revisionism. It's not revisionism. It's broader storytelling, and it's what historians do. And that's what the Historical Society is committed to, and look forward to seeing Dr. Mason's article in Annals of Iowa. I would encourage everyone to become a State Historical Society of Iowa member. Looks like we've got, Mike Plummer said grounds at the site are always open. So thank you, Mike. And I'll wait one more minute, maybe till 10:08 on my computer, and see if we have any other questions. If not, I will close down our session. So type in in Q&A or in the chat if you have any final comments. And as I said at the welcome, sometimes a minute is an eternity. So I mean, it just hit 10:08. So going to give you a 3-second last chance. 1, 2, 3. I don't see anything typing. So thank you so much, Cheryl. Great presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us at History Camp Iowa. We are going to close down this session. Thank you again.